What's the number of the politicians who actually signed your campaign list?
The campaign was started 3 years ago, and in that time span, around 900 members of parliament have endorsed the campaign and its goals. So we are cooperating with many of them all around the world. And interestingly, there is not a single US congressman who has supported the subject so far. So the reason is, I believe, that the United States Senate or the Congress, they actually conceive themselves to be a world parliament already, a kind of world parliament. So as a parliament of one of the world's leading powers, they don't think they need a UN Parliamentary Assembly because they can interact with the UN themselves directly.
What issues do you come against when you present this idea?
One of the most frequent arguments we are facing is that people believe that large countries like China, India, and others, the most populous countries, would necessarily dominate the parliament just because they have such a large share in world population. And it is possible to show that that is wrong, because any parliamentary assembly at the world level would not be composed in proportion to world population. The seats would be distributed differently, which means there would have to be a balancing between small and large states. And we have analyzed a couple of models that show that, for example, China might have in one of those models like 10% of seats, and in other models like 6%. So there would be clearly a balance. And another argument we are facing is that the body would also include parliamentarians who are actually reporting back to their governments, parliamentarians from undemocratic states. Like China is, of course, the most important example, as China is not a democracy, but such a large state, and it would have a strong position in the assembly. And we answer this by saying that in the first step, the parliamentary assembly most probably would have consultative functions only. And besides of this, it would be difficult to exclude countries who are accepted as UN member states. By definition, a UN Parliamentary Assembly would be a global assembly which is open to UN member states. So another point is that if we seek solutions to world problems like climate change, it makes no sense to exclude important countries like China. And in the long run, a parliamentary assembly could even support the strengthening of democracy in exactly such nations, because the delegates who come and participate in the proceedings, they would be influenced by the air of democratic deliberation. And there's also one procedural method which we could use to make them more independent from their home government. For example, by making it necessary that votes are taken in secret. So governments like that of China would be unable to track how their own delegates are voting in the assembly. I mean, it's at least something which needs to be discussed. We are aware that it would have some unwished consequences too, because of course the constituents of the delegates from democratic countries, they would wish to hold their, representatives accountable for how they are voting. So we have to see the pros and cons of that. But I raised it because I wanted to show that if you look at it in detail, there might be means, to counterbalance the presence of delegates from undemocratic countries.
You mentioned earlier about, you don't have any congressmen who are interested in the campaign. I think a lot of people, in the public, especially constitutionalists, are always afraid that the US Constitution will be trampled upon and ignored. Like, for instance, the Second Amendment rights, that part of the bill about it protects the rights to keep arms, and bear arms.
Yes.
So Americans are definitely for the Second Amendment, especially constitutionalists, and always afraid that perhaps out of the United Nations will come laws to say that they would have to hand their weapons in. How do you actually see that? Would the parliamentary system trample on the US Constitution in some way? Or do you think it will work with the US Constitution? Or in fact, are you going to implement some of the US Constitution?
Of course, the Parliamentary Assembly would have to rest upon basic fundamental rights. Otherwise, it would not be a useful institution.
Yes.
So, at its core, it would have to support and stick to basic human rights, including rights of freedom. And the more important point is that if a parliamentary assembly would be in place, its main function would not be to interfere into national issues, in the US or in other states, but its main purpose would be to hold international institutions accountable. That's the main purpose.
Okay.
Its purpose, the beginning, is not to make global laws. This is something, for the far future. And until we get there, decades will pass by. So in the beginning, the body's purpose would be to, for example, provide oversight over the UN and the vast system of UN organizations. And so far, I don't think that it would interfere with the sovereignty of nation states.